Ever stop to think about the less heroic side of the Old West? Behind the sunset duels was something nobody romanticizes: the smell that ruled everything. Baths were a rare luxury. When they happened, it was in the same river that watered the horses and cleaned the cooking pots. The result clung to clothes and skin for weeks. Let's unlock that rough daily life. Start with the trails. Long journeys under a blazing sun, shirts soaked with sweat that never saw a drop of soap. At the campsites, the smoke from the fire briefly masked the smell of rawhide, rancid grease, and soaked boots. Clean drinking water was a treasure saved for quenching thirst or cooking hard beans. Taking care of your body was always left for tomorrow. In the small towns that popped up near mines or forts, things weren't much better. Shallow wells gave murky water, and a rare public bath cost a lot for a wooden tub shared with strangers. Those who couldn't pay had to improvise. A damp cloth wiped across the face before braving the saloon dust or heading to Sunday Mass. And if you think that already sounds extreme, just wait. In the next few minutes, we'll reveal the not-so-elegant tricks cowboys and housewives came up with to deal with their own stench. Hacks that involved campfire ashes, dried herbs, and a whole lot of grit. Spoiler: lavender doesn't make an appearance in this story. On the frontier, dust didn't come off clothes no matter how hard you shook them. It stuck to your skin, just like the sweat mixed with soot rising from wood-burning chimneys. The little water available made everything worse. The same stream was used to quench thirst, wash pots, water the cattle, and take in waste. If a corral or an outhouse sat just a few yards upstream, every sip became a gamble. That's why clean water turned into a luxury, and the air in the settlement carried a lasting smell of people, animals, and firewood that no breeze could sweep away. When night fell, the circle around the fire was filled with stories, laughter, and strong smells. The smoke didn't just keep out the cold. It masked the scent of bodies that hadn't seen soap in days, sometimes weeks. Taking a bath took planning. Those lucky enough to have a zinc tub filled it once a week. The water was reused by the whole family, from the cleanest to the dirtiest. By the end, what was left was a warm, murky brew that looked like dirt tea. Towns made rich by the gold rush built bathhouses and charged a few coins for half an hour of soaking. For miners with money, it was comfort. For cowboys spending months on dusty trails, it was still a rare event. And so the frontier perfume lingered, soaking into shirts, blankets, and memories. A constant reminder that living out there meant accepting dust as a second skin. In the Old West, a hot bath was about as rare as a rainstorm in the middle of the desert. Whole months could go by without a single bucket of clean water touching a man's or woman's shoulders. Day after day passed, and the dust stuck to their skin, forming a layer everyone knew by heart. They knew they smelled bad. It wasn't from a lack of awareness, it was from a lack of water. When things got unbearable, people used whatever they could get their hands on. Sage, lavender, or any kind of aromatic herb became a makeshift deodorant, stuffed into clothes or even rubbed directly onto the body. If someone had tobacco, they'd light a pipe and let the smoke form a curtain around them, convinced it helped purify the air. In reality, it just swapped one smell for another, but it gave a bit of momentary relief. If baths were scarce, sanitation was practically non-existent. The bathroom was a little wooden shack built far from the front door to spare the residents' noses. Inside, a bench with a hole led straight down into a pit that slowly filled up. When it ran out of space, someone had to climb down and scoop out the foul sludge, or drag the whole structure to fresh ground and start all over again. Hygiene out there was, above all, a daily battle against stubbornly rough conditions. In the dusty towns of the Old West, public outhouses always had a line. A single wooden room served dozens, sometimes hundreds of passers-by, turning the soaked floor into a breeding ground for germs. Flies danced over everything, landing on waste, taking off, landing on food, repeating the cycle that spread fevers through the population. Comfort was an unknown luxury. Toilet paper didn't hit store shelves until the late 1800s. Until then, people used whatever fit in their hand: dried corn cobs, handfuls of grass, leaves grabbed in a hurry, or pages torn from the Sears catalog that ended up crumpled at the bottom of the latrine. Anyone who grew up with soft, triple-ply rolls has no idea what a difference that makes. Things didn't get any better when it came to mouths. With no proper dental clinics, oral health relied, at best, on makeshift brushes and liquor for mouthwash. Sugar, now cheap thanks to shipments crossing the country. Sweetened pies and candies that lit up local fairs but ate away at teeth. Cavities spread fast, gums got inflamed, and the go-to cure was pulling teeth with pliers, often right outside the general store to the soundtrack of pistols and whispers from curious onlookers. Knowing all this gives a raw picture of the daily struggle faced by those chasing prosperity west of the Mississippi. And those were just the first hurdles on that ever-expanding frontier. Out on the frontier, anyone dealing with a toothache didn't head to a fancy clinic. They ran to the village barber or blacksmith. These workers, used to blades and hammers, doubled as makeshift dentists with zero training. If you were lucky, you got a swig of whiskey. Most of the time, not even that. The same pliers used to pull nails became extraction tools, and the squeal of metal competed with the muffled screams of folks trying not to pass out. People walked away from that improvised chair leaving bits of tooth enamel on the floor, and often part of their pride. The result, sunken mouths, incomplete smiles, was just another reminder of how rough life was in the West. For anyone trying to avoid that fate, the options were almost folk remedies. Smooth sticks stood in for toothbrushes, horsehair worked as floss, and a pinch of salt or baking soda was used instead of toothpaste, if they had any. Most folks didn't even bother. With foul breath and infections lurking, they became easy targets for diseases that thrived in places without sanitation. Water pulled from streams used by both people and livestock spread cholera, typhoid, and dysentery at alarming speed. One contaminated bucket was enough to wipe out entire families. Temporary towns vanished almost overnight, leaving behind empty bedsheets, makeshift clinics, and proof that hygiene wasn't a luxury. It was survival. In the harsh life of the mining frontiers, the water that was supposed to quench thirst carried an invisible danger. When buckets were lowered into muddy wells, they came back up contaminated with cholera bacteria. Just one sip could set off a cycle of vomiting, dehydration, and within hours, complete silence. With no separate wells, men and women lined up at the same barrel, and every scoop returned germs ready to tear through the camp. Even cuts could be a death sentence. A splinter in the finger could leave the bloodstream at the mercy of microbes nobody could name. When fever hit and veins turned dark, folks called it a bad sign, since germ theory had barely reached those parts. There was no shortage of charms or prayers. What they lacked was soap, gauze, and antibiotics. Food followed the same pattern. The stew boiled in that murky water served up salmonella just as easily as it filled stomachs. With soot-blackened pots and knives that rarely got washed, stirring the pot helped spread typhoid fever among families counting coins for their next sack of beans. When pink spots showed up on the skin, it meant the stomach, not the gun, had pulled the trigger. Every sip, bite, and scratch was a reminder of something basic. On the frontier, death preferred small, quiet, dirty paths. To make it back east alive, you needed more than a gunslinger's courage. You needed clean water, which was nearly impossible to find. In a pioneer's daily life, cooking was more a test of endurance than a homey ritual. Meals started over makeshift campfires, surrounded by packed dirt, loose dust, and waste with nowhere to go. In cramped cabins or open-air camps, any effort at cleanliness vanished when the wind blew in a cloud of dirt that settled on food, pots, and people alike. Fresh water was almost never around. What they had came from muddy puddles or streams shared with cattle and wild animals. There often wasn't even enough firewood to boil it, so bacteria and parasites went straight into the pot. Plates and utensils, if they had any, got a quick rinse in that same scarce water before heading back to the table. The struggle didn't stop there. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled within hours under the summer heat. Drying or salting helped a bit, but flies were quick to lay eggs in every crack. Grains and flour kept in sacks turned into weevil farms. Settlers started sifting everything, just hoping nothing moved in the dough. Even so, that rough little kitchen stayed the heart of the camp. Every meal carried the risk of illness, but also the rare comfort of a break. And it was around those smoky embers that the boldest stories first started to take shape. They called it surprise protein, but the nickname wasn't all that funny. In the camps, bugs ended up mixed in with dried meat and beans, and the cook had to choose between picking them out or pretending not to see them. That was just the first hurdle. Dull knives and dented pots rarely touched boiling water. Soap was a luxury nobody had room for. Leftover bacon fat and bones tossed behind the wagon gave off a sharp stench that drew in rats, roaches, and flies. Loyal companions come dusk. With no trash cans or pits, the ground filled up with waste, fermenting under the sun. Every spoonful carried an invisible risk. Constant diarrhea, sudden fevers, and gut-wrenching cramps became part of daily life, but few connected the suffering to the state of the kitchen. Still, eating was non-negotiable. If you didn't eat, you didn't move forward. And if you didn't move forward, you got left behind. The fight against filth didn't stop at the plate. Clothes stiff with sweat got washed only when a stream popped up along the way. A chore that took hours of scrubbing and all your energy. Until then, shirts and dresses soaked up dust, grease, and the sour, sweet smell of cook fire smoke, doubling as homes for fleas and bed bugs. Between the crackle of firewood and the buzz of insects, every meal was a reminder that the frontier wasn't some romantic stage for heroism. It was a daily battle for survival, fought bite by bite, thread by thread. In the Old West, having a wardrobe was a distant luxury. Most people relied on just 2 or 3 basic outfits, worn until the fabric gave out at the seams. When wash day finally came around, it was an exhausting scene. A muddy riverbank, a rough scrubbing board, a cauldron of boiling water and homemade soap made from melted fat and lye strong enough to burn skin if you weren't careful. That's why the chore took hours, almost always done by women, while life impatiently carried on around them. A lot of folks just skipped the whole thing. Clothes went right back on, still marked with dust and sweat, turning cabins, saloons, and stagecoaches into cauldrons of strong odor. With no deodorant in sight, every traveler carried a personal scent that announced their arrival before their horse even stopped. Personal care rarely went much further. Long hair, common among both men and women, barely knew clean water, let alone shampoo. In no time, it turned into heavy mats of grease and dirt, hidden under hats that rarely saw soap. One hot gust of desert wind was enough to stir up the smell of leather, campfire smoke, and worn-out fabric. A reminder that on the ever-expanding frontier, smelling good was as far off as the next town. In pioneer settlements, hair care was a distant luxury. Washing your head? Only once in a while, sometimes after weeks. With no shampoo around, settlers used whatever they had. A chunk of hard soap saved for emergencies or grease dripping from freshly roasted meat, rubbed into the hair to keep it from drying out. The result was pretty much what you'd expect. Hair got tangled, weighed down with oil and dust, and lice spread from kids to adults as fast as gossip in a small town. When an infestation got out of hand, the only options were shaving it all off or turning to harsh fixes like pure kerosene, which burned, smelled awful, and could even cause chemical burns. Skin took a beating too. Without scented lotions or jars of moisturizer, faces and hands were exposed daily to harsh sun, dry air, and icy winds. Cracks, blisters, and dark spots told the story of each long day's work. Some folks would smear on lard or seed oil hoping for relief, but the comfort came with a strong smell and a sticky feel. Out in the open, cowboys, farmhands, and wagon drivers got hit even harder. A whole day under the desert sky left skin burning and lips splitting, with nothing between them and the relentless sun. Over time, faces took on a weathered look, almost like aged leather, and every new line told the tale of another season worked and endured. A simple mosquito buzz is enough to drive anyone crazy these days. Now picture yourself on the Old West frontier, where dust, food scraps, and a total lack of sanitation created a daily army of pests. Flies swarmed constantly around outhouses and food storage sheds, landing on anything in sight. When the sun went down, mosquitoes came out of the swamps and puddles left by horses, carrying diseases like malaria in certain areas. Folks looking for shelter at roadside inns found mattresses packed with bed bugs, loyal travel companions that waited until night to attack. Fleas weren't far behind. They hitched rides on cattle, jumped to clothes and blankets, and the itching never seemed to stop. With no bug spray or pesticides, people turned to bundles of rue hanging over doorways, smoky campfires, and a whole lot of patience. In the barns, rats and mice fought for space among sacks of grain, chewing through fabric, spreading disease, and scaring even the toughest cats. For those sleeping under the stars, other dangers lurked. Scorpions hiding in boots left outside and snakes crawling into thin, patchy blankets for warmth. Every inch of the frontier was a reminder that living beyond civilization took more than just guts. It demanded constant awareness, sharp ears, and tough skin, because the next bite could come before the rooster's first crow. Have you ever stopped to think about what it took for a woman to stay clean on the edge of the frontier? No drugstores, no plumbing, and barely any soap. She had to improvise every single day. Scraps of cloth were cut, sewn, and tied around the waist to manage her monthly flow. Afterward, they went to the stream, where the murky water washed out some of the mess before they were hung in a hurry behind the cabin. The same kind of improvising came when her body signaled the arrival of a child. As soon as the pain kicked in, the dinner table turned into a birthing bed, boiled sheets stood in for sterilized tools, and the midwife, often just an experienced neighbor, was the only line of defense between the mother and the fever that hovered over the newborn. As if that wasn't enough, their clothes worked against them. Heavy dresses, layered petticoats, and tight corsets soaked up sweat, dust, and stove smoke. Each soaked piece took hours to dry out on the porch, and washing it meant using firewood meant for cooking. To mask odors, sprigs of rue and rosemary were tucked into their skirts, a trick that fooled the nose but didn't scare off the lurking germs. Between a quick dip in the freezing river and stitching new cloth pads, these women wove day after day a routine of care that kept the whole family going. More than tilling the land or tending the livestock, they fought quietly for their own health in an environment that gave them almost nothing in return. In the harsh life on the frontier, a cut on the finger could mean more than just momentary pain. It was an open invitation to the silent threat of infection. Back then, medicine was still in its early days. Settlers turned to prayers, teas, and bottles of strong liquor because doctors were rare. And when they did show up, they brought worn-out tools and knew little about germs. For scrapes and wounds, they poured on moonshine or slapped on herbal poultices. It burned, but mostly just delayed the danger. When things got worse, bloodletting was the go-to. They'd open a vein and let the bad blood drain out, hoping the body would heal itself. Most of the time, it just left the patient weaker and more helpless. If the knife had to go deeper, like in an amputation, there was no anesthesia beyond gulps of rum and a stick between the teeth. Tools went from one patient to another without being washed. That alone was enough to let gangrene take hold. Hospitals, when they existed, were dirt floor shacks. Flies danced over the cots, fevers hung in the air. Behind wooden walls, death piled up while typhoid, smallpox, and dysentery marched on unchecked. Ironically, many nearby indigenous nations followed simple, effective cleaning routines that kept outbreaks at bay. A reminder that wisdom didn't live only in European books, but also along the trails that cut through the forest. If you think hygiene in the Old West was just about rare baths and barrels of stagnant water, it's time to rethink that image. Among many indigenous nations, cleanliness was part of daily life. Fine sand and plant fibers stood in for soap, and sweat lodges purified both body and mind. Taking care of health also meant managing water and waste without harming the environment. Streams stayed clean, waste returned to the soil, and wounds were treated with herbal poultices that stopped infections before fever could set in. Meanwhile, European settlers brought urban habits that didn't work so well in dry lands far from infrastructure. trash piles, and contaminated water sources let diseases spread quickly through crowded streets. The contrast was striking. Native peoples had lower rates of contamination because they treated the stream that quenched their thirst as an ally, not a sewer. Still, Hollywood painted a different picture. Cowboys show up in crisp shirts, saloon girls seem to smell like perfume, and dust is just a costume piece, not a real threat. We almost never see the mud, the sweat, the mosquitoes, or the smells that were part of the real story. By recognizing that gap, we see how harsh the frontier really was, and how much indigenous knowledge was lost when their voices were silenced. It's in that gap that the myths we're about to break down were born. When people think of the Old West, it's common to picture a flawless hero riding into the sunset. But the trail told a different story. Dust stuck to the face, dried sweat turning shirts into a second layer of stiff fabric, hair matted with natural grease. From one camp to the next, a bath was a rare privilege, fought over in muddy rivers or makeshift barrels in the towns. The ladies of the saloons, painted in pamphlets as images of elegance, dealt with the same hardships. Heavy dresses hid patches of dust. Strong perfumes tried and failed to cover the scent of tobacco, alcohol, and horses that filled the air. Gunslingers, gamblers, and cowboys came to the table soaked in sweat, boots caked in mud and jackets stiff from their own bodies. With no sewage system, germs moved faster than any stagecoach. Simple wounds turned into fevers that took down men used to sleeping under the open sky. The barber's blade wasn't just for trimming beards. It often stood in for medical tools, spreading disease with every unsterilized cut. Clean clothes became a trophy that, once earned, quickly took on a new layer of red dust. It was on this rough stage that the legends of the West were born. Every saloon door creak, every bandana pulled over a face, was a reminder that before the glamour came a thick daily grind of dust, sweat, and danger, and the next ambush was always just around the corner. Beneath constant dust, scarce water, and miles between baths, those who dared to settle the frontier didn't give up. Between creaking wagons and smoky campfires that burned late into the night, families built makeshift homes, started small schools, and created new routines in a land that seemed to offer only desert and danger. Every well dug, every stubborn seed planted in that cracked soil was a daily reminder. It's possible to grow even where the world says you can't. But growing didn't mean smelling like soap. With no plumbing and barely any reliable products, baths were rare events, clothes dried stiff with dirt, and teeth went days without seeing a brush. The fantasy Hollywood sells, shiny hats, spotless gunslingers, glittering saloons, is way too polished to match the real thing. Those who took the risk out west lived with untreated wounds, stubborn lice, and the constant feeling that their own smell gave them away. So when you turn on the faucet, feel the soap lather, or end your night with a toothbrush and floss, take a second to appreciate the quiet privilege of living in the 21st century. The Old West was bold, it was dramatic, and it gave us unforgettable stories. But it was never clean. That's the raw and far from tidy truth that rarely makes it onto the big screen. Liked getting a whiff of this not-so-sweet side of history? Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and come back for more behind-the-scenes stories the dust of time tried to bury.